Imagine this. Imagine in America where 16 million are infected with an airborne virus and 100,000 have died. Imagine in America where 40 million are unemployed and that 40 to 43% of small businesses will go bankrupt and close its doors permanently by the end of this year. No, this isn't a thought experiment, nor is it a mental exercise. It's the reality in which we're going to be living. So, how do we deal with this? How do we help the people? And where do we go from here? Well, let's find out. In order to really examine where we should go from here, I believe that we first ought to take a look at the background surrounding the finances of the American people. In reality, we're built up to believe that the American economy is so fantastic because of a booming stock market. When in reality, I don't believe that the stock market is a good indicator for why the American people are doing well or poorly with their finances. I just generally tend to subscribe to the thought that it's not a good indication, and it's not a good indication because the 10% of Americans there's 10% of Americans who own 84% of stocks. And it's also not a good indication because they tend to prop up businesses with the $2.3 trillion stimulus that was given to it by the Federal Reserve. So for that and a variety of other reasons, I tend to subscribe that the stock market is not a good indication of how well the American people are doing. Instead, let's look at some actual statistics of how the American people are doing. And for that, I say that we first ought to look at the 78% of Americans who live paycheck to paycheck. The majority of Americans who have less than $500 in their bank account in case of an emergency, and even less percent of Americans who have over $1,000 in their bank account in case of an emergency. Now, this points to two different possibilities. It's either that Americans are being drastically underpaid for their work and that wages have been stagnant, or it's the case that perhaps Americans are bad at saving their money and they spend. Either one is the possibility, and that's up for an entirely different debate in and of itself. But today we're going to be looking at the actual fragility of the American finances. So we also have to take a look at the median income, which is around $56,000, and the fact that the average American, 52% of Americans, so the majority of Americans, earn $30,000 or less annually. Those figures, the fact that a majority of Americans don't have more than $500 in their bank account, the fact that most Americans live paycheck to paycheck, the fact that most Americans earn $30,000 or less a year, those should be startling figures. Startling because it really just shows how fragile the finances of the average American are. Yes, you may be well off, but your fellow American is likely not. So, what happens when we have a recession and depression with this type of financial system, the system that shows that the American economic lifestyle is not sustainable? It's not, because when you have a recession depression, they are not going to have this money to keep themselves afloat. So, what do we do to counteract this? Well, first and foremost, we ought to have a universal basic income system. Now, I should specify that this UBI type system should be temporary. It shouldn't be a permanent fixture in the American political system, and it should be purely temporary as to make sure that the average American has just enough to get by. So what that number should be? Well, it needs to be more than the one-time check from the federal government of $1,200. I can tell you that much. The stimulus package was not enough. It wasn't. It didn't provide enough for small businesses because large corporations were able to take the funds that small businesses should be able to receive because of loopholes, such as, for example, large corporations with less than 500 employees at one designated location were able to take small business funds in the stimulus package that passed back in March. So it didn't do enough for small businesses, and it didn't do enough for the people, which I think should be the primary goal when policy making. Act for the people first. You should not act for the business first. Act for the people. Do what is best for the people. And so you have that aspect. But you also have to look at the flaws of the $1,200 stimulus package that was passed back in March. Well, it was means tested beyond belief. So what does that mean? Well, when I say that it was means tested so if you had a AGI, adjusted gross income, of more than $75,000 a year, you were ineligible to receive the stimulus package. But if you made less than that AGI of $75,000, you were capable of receiving the package. So, when we talk about universalizing it, the universalization process would mean everyone gets it. Now, I'm sure you might have heard on the news that there are some people who have yet to receive their stimulus checks, and there were some that got it a long time ago, because this bill passed in March, but there are people who still have yet to receive it. Well, it's very likely that if you are in need of a stimulus check, you very well need the stimulus check. So why hasn't everyone gotten yet? Well, that's cited for two different reasons. The first reason being that President Trump delayed the physical checks from arriving at households because he felt the need to have them signed by his signature and say, the stimulus check, then President Donald J. Trump. But the other factor was that it was means tested. If you universalize this and just give it to everyone, well, what simply is going to happen is everyone will get it in a timely fashion, because they won't need to make sure if you qualify versus you don't qualify. Everyone qualifies for it. So everyone will be getting these checks in a much, much, much faster fashion, as opposed to waiting 2 months after the original bill was signed and passed. So what do we do next? What was the other flaw with the stimulus package? Well, the other flaw with the stimulus package, and this may sound like a good thing at face value, was that it gave $500 to every, an additional $500 per child under the age of 17. And while this may sound fantastic, and I agree that that part of the bill was a good idea, what was not a good idea was to have it cut off at the age of 17. There are college-age students that had to come home because of this virus, who were not accounted for, because they still write on their tax returns as independents, and as dependents, and as a result, they do not receive the stimulus check. Their parents don't receive a $500 extra. So instead, what the Democrats and Republicans should go up and do is, when they implement this UBI system, tack on an additional $500 for every dependent in the household, or college-age dependent. Because when they came home from college, well, what happened was the parents then had to supply food and electricity and had to house them again, when in reality they should have been off at college, not being fed by the parents. And there should have been some economic relief in that sense. So what else should this stimulus package do? This new stimulus package do? Well, it should continue what the old one did. Suspend college loans until September. It should also do one other thing. Place a moratorium on car loans. For those of you that don't know, there's $1.2 trillion in the car loan bubble. And I say bubble because I mean it's a bubble. I think that's similar to the 2007-2008 financial crisis. We're going to see a new bubble, but this time, instead of a real estate crisis, it's going to be a car loan crisis. A car loan crisis is going to be much worse, because there's a infamous phrase that you can live in your car and drive your car to work, but you can't drive your house to work, but you can live in your house. And that's a very factual statement. You can drive your car to work and under dire circumstances live in your car. But if your car is repossessed, you cannot do that. If cars get repossessed during this crisis, which is very likely to happen given that 2 million cars get repossessed on an annual basis, and 5,000 get repossessed daily, well, if people are unable to pay those loans and unable to pay those car bills, well, within anywhere from 30 to 90 days is typically the repossession period. Well, if they're unable to pay, it's very likely that they won't have a method of getting to work once this crisis is done with, once they're able to go back to work. So what we ought to do is we ought to place a car loan moratorium saying that, look, car lenders, you will get your money. The federal government or the state governments will supply you your money, or just put it off and allow the people to pay you back later. But if we have cars taken away, people will be unable to go to work. They'll be able to relieve some of the economic crisis at hand. But what else should this bill do? Well, the bill should also put a freeze on rent. It should put a freeze on rent because if people are unable, and this is obvious, if people are unable to go to work to pay their bills, how are they going to pay for rent? How are they still going to have a roof over their head? And in some cases, the stimulus package that was passed back in March did accomplish this. But it didn't go far enough. It put a temporary freeze, which is about to expire. But if you put a semi-permanent freeze until the public health crisis is dealt with and people can actually start going back to work and there's almost full employment, not total full employment, but almost full employment, well, what you can do is then you can have people pay back the landlords later. But what should be done is that you need to go ahead and implement a federal jobs guarantee program. If you implement a federal jobs guarantee program, it serves two purposes. First, people will be able to be guaranteed a job by the federal government. These are well-paying jobs with insurance attached. So you might be thinking to yourself, well, that must be expensive. Because if it's a well-paying job, it pays $15 an hour, so a living wage, as well as guaranteed health care for those workers because it's a federal government job. Well, that ought to be expensive, and it is. Admittedly, according to the Center on Budget and Policy Priorities, it costs $543 billion annually. And this was based on 2018 statistics. So yes, is it likely during a time of unemployment that that cost will rise? Yes. But as I said, this kind of policy serves two purposes. The other purpose it solves is to implement a policy that would give us better infrastructure projects. Because if we do something similar to what the New Deal did back during the Great Depression, we can have great infrastructure once again. Currently, if you remember back to my Joe Biden video, the first video uploaded onto this channel, is that our infrastructure by the Common Core of Engineers typically receives anywhere from a D- to a D+ on its grading. So if we were to implement this kind of policy, a federal jobs guarantee program, people, yes, they'd be able to get to work, and that would overall stimulate the economy because people would have money in their pockets to go ahead and then spend. But also, we'd once again have good infrastructure projects. If you look at Germany or Japan, a lot of their infrastructure is spent by public spending. It exists in this realm of public-private. And yeah, that can be done for this federal jobs guarantee program. You shouldn't just contract out to the public individuals, work at the private sector as well. But yes, I believe that there should be a federal jobs guarantee because everyone who needs a job during a recession or depression, which is very likely what we are going to see in a post-public health crisis world, is that we will see a worldwide depression or recession, and that we should be there for our fellow Americans who need a job. But as I said, this is going to be a worldwide depression or recession. And as a result of that, we ought to take a look at implementing a policy that will help businesses as well. Because if you recall to the intro of my video, I made a statement saying that 40 to 43% of small businesses will close permanently. And that's the fact of the matter. Now, what can be done to stop this? Well, at the moment, the minimum that we can do is we can place a freeze on overhead costs. Things like rent, electricity, water, and things like that, until small businesses are able to fully reopen. Now, if you're a small business that's currently open, such as a food joint, well, maybe you don't necessarily need to get that same funding. But it should still exist to the majority of small businesses that are closed, because small businesses make up 99.7% of the U.S. jobs in this country. So if 40 to 43% of them go away, that's an elimination of the overwhelming majority of jobs within this country. So what can we also do in response? Well, as you recall to what I said about the stimulus package was flawed. The stimulus package was flawed because it gave funds to small business. And I put small business in quotes because it really wasn't small business. The Small Business Administration, the SBA, defines small business as anywhere from under 500 employees per location. Let me tell you this. 500 employees per location is not a small business. There are major corporations that own restaurant chains, such as a Red Lobster, or Olive Garden, or things like that receive money from a small business loan, when in reality, they are not small business. Yes, are corporations hurting as well? Absolutely. I'm not denying that, nor is anybody else. But small businesses are hurting the most because they don't have the finances to keep themselves afloat. So what are we to do? Well, perhaps if we redefine what a small business is, we'll be able to reassess, well, what businesses are getting what money. Instead of having a general pool that any corporations with 500 employees or less per location, not per business, but per location. If we reassess what it means to be a small business, we can better allocate funds to actual small businesses. So, what should we do? What number should that be changed to? Frankly, I'm not sure. But if we rely on something like the Obamacare standards for what constitutes a small business, it would be 100 employees or less per location. And I feel like that in and of itself is a fair judgment of what a small business is. There's no reason that a mom and pop shop that houses less than 20 employees should be in the same pool as a major corporation, as a major chain that houses less than 500 employees. You ought to break them up into smaller groups. But what else can be done? Because yes, as I admitted, corporations and big business are struggling as well. Well, what we're to do at the present is unknown, because we're not sure what the current crisis is going to look like after the public health crisis is done. What we are to do is we are to offer them loans. But those loans should come attached with a "you owe us" statement. And that "you owe us" statement should be policy. So what I mean by that is, let's say you're going to bail out the airlines. That's fantastic. Airlines are a business that we need in this country. It's obvious. But what are you to do if you bail them out? We can't just give them money. So what are we going to do? Tell them that they ought to lower their emission standards. And yes, Democrats are doing this, but they're doing it ineffectually. I'm going to explain why in a little bit. What they're doing is totally incorrect. What they ought to do is they ought to tell airlines, look, we'll give you your bailout. You won't even need to owe us back. But what you have to do is by the year 2024, or just any arbitrary year that they want to set as the standard, you have to lower your emissions. So if they were to do that, they get the funding. If you want to bail out a fast food chain, for example, tell them this: pay your employees a living wage. Pay them $15 an hour and we'll give you funding. You don't have to pay us back even. If you tell them that, well, they'll take it because they'll need to be bailed out. But if they don't take it, well, then it's their loss because they have an opportunity to obtain money from the government. So why do I state that the Democrats are going about this incorrectly? Well, I state that the Democrats are doing this incorrectly for one main reason. Nancy Pelosi has presented a bill listing pretty much everything I just said. And I largely agree with this bill. But the problem is, Mitch McConnell is right when he criticizes it. When Mitch McConnell says that it is the Democrats' wet dream to have everything in this bill, he's right. It's literally the Democratic agenda. It's all stuffed into one bill. There's no reason that a stimulus for the people should be in the same bill as the Green New Deal. Am I a believer in the Green New Deal? Yeah, I am. Admittedly, I do believe in the Green New Deal. Parts of it, at least. But there's no reason the Green New Deal and Medicare for All should all be stuffed into the same bill as an immediate stimulus package for the American people. A stimulus package that the American people need. So when Mitch McConnell criticizes Nancy Pelosi on her moves with this bill, he's right. He's absolutely right. So how about this, Democrats, and I'm talking to you. Instead of putting them all in one bill, advocate for them separately. People are struggling. 78% of Americans live paycheck to paycheck. And it's expected that the majority, or at least a slim plurality, will lose their jobs at some point within the next year, by the end of 2021. We ought to take a look at that seriously, and instead of pushing for your agenda in the same bill that would give universal basic income to all the American people who actually need it right now, stop playing politics and actually fight for the American people. Don't stuff your entire agenda into one bill. That's ridiculous, that's ludicrous, and when Mitch McConnell criticizes you, he's right. So Democrats, play the game. Make 3 different bills. One that helps business, one that helps small business, and one that helps the people. Don't stuff them all into one bill. Because if you stuff them into one bill, the Republicans will win. The Republicans will rightfully criticize you that what you are doing is politicizing a public health crisis.
2 days ago, the press reported that a senior member of the House Democratic leadership told his colleagues, quote, "This is a tremendous opportunity to restructure things to fit our vision." This is not a political opportunity. This is a national emergency.
You're making the public health crisis about the Green New Deal. When in reality, if you were to talk about the public health crisis, which can be tied right to the stimulus the American people are receiving, and if you were to then tie the business and small business loans or mandates that they have to follow, such as the $15 minimum wage and the lowering of carbon emission, to an actual economic crisis, well, those are 2 different debates. So stop politicizing this crisis, Nancy Pelosi. Stop it. Pass 3 different bills that will all help the American economy. And until then, Mitch McConnell has every right to criticize your politics. Stop politicizing a crisis. I hope you guys enjoyed this episode of the Paulitics Show. This coming Friday, I'm going to be interviewing state Senate candidate from Connecticut, George Cabrera. And next Monday, well, you have to find out on Friday what I'm going to be talking about. Until then, be well, stay safe, and have yourselves a good one.